They stormed in with fake badges, ready to arrest an old man, but seconds later, they learned he commanded an entire Marine battalion. The morning had begun like any other, calm, golden lights spilling across the quiet suburban street, birds chirping in the oak trees, and the smell of fresh coffee drifting from the kitchen. I was halfway down the steps of our porch, still rubbing the sleep from my eyes, when the peace shattered like glass. 3 men I had never seen before strode through the front gate without knocking, their heavy boots crunching against the gravel path. They weren't police, that much was clear. Their uniforms were cheap and ill-fitting. Their badges looked like they'd been ordered from novelty shop, and one of them was already fumbling with a piece of paper that looked suspiciously like a printed-out flyer. But they moved with the arrogance of men who believed they had authority. "Step aside, son," the one in front barked, shoving past me as if he owned the property. He was tall and bulky, his mirrored sunglasses hiding his eyes, his jaw set like he was auditioning for a role he didn't deserve. "We're here on official HOA business. Your grandfather is under arrest for multiple violations of community code." For a moment, I thought I'd misheard him. "Under arrest?" I repeated, staring at him in disbelief. "You can't arrest anyone. You're—" He ignored me and motioned to the other 2 men, who split off and flanked the porch like they were performing some tactical maneuver. My grandfather stepped out of the doorway just then, dressed in his usual morning attire, faded cargo pants, a plain gray t-shirt, and his old Marine Corps cap that he never went a day without wearing. Despite the sudden intrusion, he didn't look surprised. If anything, he looked tired, like he had been expecting this for a long time. "Morning," he said calmly, his voice steady as stone. "You boys lost. Name's not important," the man with the sunglasses snapped. "You violated multiple HOA codes: unauthorized flag placement, non-compliant mailbox color, and obstruction of community standards. You've been warned, and now we're taking you into custody." "Custody?" My grandfather raised an eyebrow, not moving from the top step. "And under what law do you think you have that power?" "Community enforcement statutes give us full authority to act," the man declared, waving the flimsy paper like it was a federal warrant. "You're coming with us." Now, I could feel my heart racing. This wasn't a warning or a fine. They were actually trying to drag my grandfather off his property. "You can't do this," I said, stepping between them. "You're not real cops. You don't have—" "Step aside," the man growled again, shoving me backward. My heel caught on the edge of the step, and I stumbled, grabbing the railing to steady myself. The other 2 moved in closer, one of them pulling a pair of cheap metal handcuffs from his belt. And that's when everything changed. My grandfather didn't yell or resist. He didn't even raise his voice. He just looked the man dead in the eye and said, in that calm, level tone that used to make new recruits straighten up in seconds, "Before you put your hands on me, son, you might want to ask yourself if you're prepared for the consequences of impersonating law enforcement on a veteran's property." The words hung in the air like a warning bell. For a moment, the men hesitated, but only for a moment. Then they laughed. "Veteran or not, you're breaking the rules," the man sneered. "And we don't care who you think you are. We're the authority here." "Authority," my grandfather repeated softly, almost as if testing the word. He glanced at their badges, then at the piece of paper still flapping in the morning breeze. "That's not a legal document, and those aren't real badges, which means you're trespassing, threatening, and attempting unlawful detainment. I'd reconsider your next move very carefully." But they didn't reconsider. They reached for him. The bulky man grabbed my grandfather's arm roughly, and in a flash, the calm old man I knew vanished. With one smooth motion, my grandfather twisted his wrist, breaking the man's grip, and pivoted just enough to step out of reach. It wasn't violent. It wasn't even aggressive. But it was efficient, the kind of movement you don't learn in a self-defense class. The kind of movement you only learn in the military. "Don't touch me again," he said quietly. The man stumbled back, his face flushed red with anger. "You just assaulted an HOA officer." "You just trespassed and attempted kidnapping," my grandfather replied evenly. "If you were real officers, you'd know that." The 2 others exchanged uncertain looks. It was clear they hadn't expected resistance. They were used to people folding under their fake authority. My grandfather stepped forward now, his presence suddenly commanding the entire yard. The air shifted, and even though he hadn't raised his voice, the weight of command was unmistakable. "You have 30 seconds to leave this property," he said, his tone still calm but colder now. "After that, I'll be calling a sheriff and reporting all 3 of you for impersonating law enforcement, trespassing, and attempted unlawful detention. And believe me, they'll take that very seriously." "You're bluffing," the leader scoffed, but there was a flicker of doubt behind the sunglasses now. My grandfather tilted his head slightly. "Do I look like a man who bluffs?" That was when the wind shifted just enough to rustle the small American flag flying from our porch. The same one Leonard Briggs, the HOA president, had fined us for last month. It snapped crisply in the morning breeze, and the sound seemed to punctuate the silence that followed. The man's hand twitched toward his radio, but then he froze. From down the street came the low, unmistakable sound of sirens. Not loud yet, still distant, but getting closer. I glanced at my grandfather, and he gave the faintest hint of a smile. "What did you do?" I whispered. "Let's just say I made a phone call," he murmured. The men looked around nervously now, the arrogance draining from their faces. One of them muttered something under his breath, and another started backing toward the gate. "Stay right where you are," the leader snapped, but even his voice had lost its earlier certainty. "We're not done here." "You're done," my grandfather said simply. "And if you're smart, you'll walk away before the sheriff gets here and asks why 3 men in fake badges tried to arrest a retired Marine on his own land." The sirens grew louder. The men exchanged panicked looks, and then, without another word, they turned and hurried back the way they'd come, disappearing into a waiting SUV parked half a block away. For a moment, the street was quiet again. The breeze tugged at the flag, and the early sunlight spilled across the yard. My grandfather stood at the top of the steps, his expression unreadable. "Grandpa," I said finally, breaking the silence. "Who were they? What just happened?" He adjusted the brim of his cap and sighed. "They weren't police, and they weren't acting alone. That was Leonard's doing. Leonard Briggs, the HOA president." I had heard the name whispered around the neighborhood, usually followed by stories of intimidation, fines, and threats. But even in the worst stories, no one had ever mentioned something like this. "He's pushing too far," I said. My grandfather's eyes hardened. "Yes, and he thinks he's untouchable. But he's just made a very big mistake." "What are you going to do?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. He just watched the road where the SUV had vanished, and then turned his gaze toward the flag still fluttering proudly on the porch. "Something I haven't done in a long time," he said quietly. "I'm going to fight back." And in that moment, as the sound of approaching sirens grew louder and the wind carried the flag higher, I realized the 3 impostors had done more than try to arrest a man. They had woken up someone who had once commanded men on battlefields, someone who understood patience, strategy, and retribution better than any HOA president ever could. They thought they could bully an old Marine. They had no idea what was coming. The day after the fake arrest attempt, the neighborhood seemed quieter than usual, but it was the kind of silence that felt heavy, like the pause before a storm. My grandfather spent most of the morning on the porch, sitting beneath the shade of the flag they'd tried to tear down, sipping his coffee in silence. I could tell by the way he stared across the street that his mind wasn't here. It was somewhere deeper, calculating, measuring, preparing. Across the cul-de-sac, a silver sedan rolled slowly to a stop. The driver's side window lowered with a mechanical hum, and there he was, Leonard Briggs. Clipboard balanced on his steering wheel, dark sunglasses masking his eyes, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. He didn't wave. He didn't speak. He just sat there, writing something down, glancing up every few seconds at our house. "That's him," I muttered, stepping beside my grandfather. "That's Leonard." My grandfather didn't look at me. I know. Leonard Briggs had been the self-appointed emperor of this neighborhood for nearly 8 years. A retired accountant with a taste for authority and a talent for manipulation, he had turned the Homeowners Association into his personal throne. At first, neighbors tolerated him because he kept the lawns neat and the streets quiet. But power changes men, and Leonard's thirst for control grew with every rule he enforced. What began as friendly reminders about trash pickup schedules evolved into fines for porch lights being too bright, threats for leaving a hose uncoiled, and letters citing visual disharmony for mismatched flower pots. And now, it seemed, Leonard had a new target: my grandfather. It had started small. A letter claiming the American flag on our porch was unauthorized decor. Then a fine for the shade of green on our mailbox, even though it had been the same color for 30 years. When my grandfather ignored those, Leonard escalated, accusing him of creating unapproved noise disturbances with his wind chimes, even filing a formal complaint about the size of our driveway, which hadn't changed since the house was built. But Leonard didn't just weaponize paperwork. He watched. Sometimes, late at night, I'd catch the faint glow of headlights parked across the street, the outline of Leonard's car lingering in the dark. Other times, he'd stroll past during the day, phone in hand, pretending to check messages while taking photos of our yard. Once, I even found a small drone hovering above our backyard. It zipped away the second I stepped outside, but there was no doubt in my mind who was behind it. One afternoon, my grandfather confronted him. "Leonard," he said, walking calmly to the end of the driveway as the HOA president strutted down the street with his clipboard. "We need to talk." Leonard turned with exaggerated politeness. "About what, Raymond?" "Your growing list of violations." "My flag, my mailbox, my driveway," my grandfather said, crossing his arms. "All grandfathered in, all legal, and you know it." Leonard chuckled, a low, mocking sound. "The HOA board decides what's legal here, not you. You may have been someone once, but in this neighborhood, you follow the rules." My grandfather's gaze didn't waver. "Rules don't override state or federal law, and they don't override my rights as a homeowner." Leonard stepped closer, lowering his voice until it was barely above a whisper. "You think those rights mean anything here? I've been doing this for years, Raymond. People don't fight me. They pay their fines, repaint their houses, and keep their heads down. If you're smart, you'll do the same." There was something cold behind Leonard's smile, something predatory. And as he walked away, clipboard tucked under his arm, he added over his shoulder, "Or I'll make sure this neighborhood becomes very uncomfortable for you." It wasn't an empty threat. 2 days later, a formal violation notice arrived, citing structural noncompliance and demanding that we repaint the mailbox within 10 days or face escalating fines. Then came another notice, this one accusing my grandfather of storing unapproved materials on his property, referring, apparently, to the garden tools in the backyard shed. When that didn't work, Leonard turned to something more insidious: rumor. Neighbors who had once waved now avoided eye contact. Conversations stopped when we walked by. One evening, I overheard 2 men whispering near the park entrance. "I heard he's unstable," one said. "Did a tour overseas. You know how those guys come back." "That's what Leonard said," the other replied. "Told me to keep an eye on him. Said he's been causing trouble." It was a classic tactic: isolate, discredit, control. And Leonard executed it with precision. But what he didn't realize was that my grandfather had faced far worse than petty tyrants with clipboards. "Let him talk," my grandfather said when I told him what I'd heard. He was cleaning his old Marine Corps compass at the kitchen table, the same one he'd carried through the desert decades ago. "The more noise he makes, the more mistakes he'll make. And when he does, we'll be ready." Still, Leonard's tactics grew bolder. One morning, we found a bright orange sticker slapped across our front door. "Notice of enforcement action. Property subject TO lien." It was unsigned, and no legal documentation accompanied it. But the intent was clear: intimidation. "He can't do this," I said, tearing it down. "He just did," my grandfather replied calmly, slipping the notice into a folder already thick with letters, photos, and documents. "And every piece of paper he gives us is one more piece of evidence." The confrontation that followed was inevitable. 3 days later, Leonard showed up unannounced, walking up the driveway like he owned the place. He didn't knock. He didn't even greet us. He just began circling the yard, scribbling notes on his clipboard, and snapping photos with his phone. "This tree is too close to the curb," he muttered. "Driveway needs repainting. That shed might be over the allowed height." "Leonard," my grandfather said, stepping out onto the porch. "You're trespassing." "I'm conducting an inspection," Leonard replied without looking up. "Not without permission, you're not." Leonard finally turned to face him, a faint sneer curling his lip. "Do you really want to test me, Raymond? Because I guarantee you, I can make your life miserable." "You already have," my grandfather said. "But you've also made one mistake." Leonard raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" "You think I'm afraid of you." For the first time, Leonard's smirk faltered, but he recovered quickly, chuckling as he backed down the driveway. "We'll see about that." And then, as if to prove his point, he sent another notice the very next morning, this time threatening legal action if we didn't remove the flag from the porch within 5 days. Attached was a blurry photograph of my grandfather standing on the porch at night, clearly taken from the street. "He's watching us," I said, staring at the photo. "This is getting out of hand." My grandfather was silent for a long time before speaking. "It's already out of hand. But remember this, son. Men like Leonard always think they're untouchable. They believe their little kingdoms can't fall. But they can, and they will." He opened the drawer of his desk and pulled out a worn leather notebook, the same one he had carried during his years in the Marines. He flipped it open and began writing. Dates, times, names, every incident, every violation, every threat. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Building a record," he said without looking up. "Because someday soon, Leonard is going to go too far. And when he does, I'll be ready." There was something in his voice that made me shiver. Not anger, not even resentment, but certainty. It was the tone of a man who had been through real battles and understood how to win them. And as I watched him methodically document Leonard's harassment, I realized that the HOA president had no idea who he was dealing with. Leonard Briggs thought he was fighting an old man with a flag and a stubborn streak. What he didn't know was that he had declared war on a Marine commander who had spent his life outthinking enemies far more dangerous than him. And the worst part for Leonard? My grandfather wasn't fighting yet. He was still preparing. The storm hadn't started, but it was coming. And when it did, Leonard's clipboard and fake authority wouldn't save him. Not this time. The night it all changed was colder than usual, the kind of chill that crept under doors and made the street lamps flicker in the fog. My grandfather sat alone at the kitchen table, a steaming mug of tea untouched beside him, his eyes fixed on the monitor displaying the live feed from the security cameras. He had grown accustomed to Leonard Briggs' petty harassment. The letters, the threats, the endless citations for imaginary violations. But something in the air tonight felt different. Too still, too quiet. Across the street, a dark sedan idled with its headlights off. It had been there for nearly 20 minutes. My grandfather watched it without expression, but his mind was alert, methodically cataloging every detail. He had seen vehicles like that before. Not here, but in other, far more dangerous places. And he knew, deep down, that Leonard had escalated beyond fines and gossip. He was right. At exactly 2:13 a.m., two men emerged from the shadows beside the sedan. Dressed in dark uniforms with shiny badges clipped to their belts, they moved with a practiced swagger meant to mimic authority. One of them raised a flashlight and swept it across the yard. The other pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and slapped it against the gate with theatrical precision. Homeowners Association Enforcement Unit. One of them muttered under his breath, though no one but the other could hear. "Let's make this quick." From the kitchen, my grandfather zoomed in on their faces. Unfamiliar. No official insignias, no real law enforcement gear, just costume badges and utility belts that looked bought from a surplus store. His jaw tightened. Leonard had crossed a line. The men approached the front door and hammered on it with the sides of their fists. "Open up. We have a warrant for code violations." One barked, his voice rehearsed but unsteady. My grandfather stayed seated, unmoved by the performance. Instead, he quietly reached into a drawer and retrieved a small, leather-bound notebook. He flipped to a blank page, wrote the time and description of the two men, and added a short note. Suspected impersonation of law enforcement. Potential trespass. Possible directive from Briggs. Then, without a sound, he stood and walked to the hallway closet. Behind a row of coats, a small black box blinked softly, the backup power unit he had installed 2 months earlier. Leonard's men might have thought cutting the main power line would blind the cameras, but the footage continued to roll, stored securely on a hidden drive. Outside, the men exchanged frustrated glances when no one answered. "He's ignoring us," one hissed. "Briggs said he'd cave by now." "Let's check the garage," the other replied. "That truck's still here. We can tow it and make a point." They moved toward the driveway, muttering about towing fees and citations. But as one of them stepped onto the property, a motion sensor light flared to life, bathing them in harsh white light. They froze, startled, and for a brief second, one looked straight into the hidden camera mounted beneath the eaves. It was all the confirmation my grandfather needed. By dawn, Leonard Briggs' enforcers had left, their fake warrant crumpled on the porch and an empty tow truck idling down the block. But the damage was done, not to my grandfather, but to Leonard himself. Every step, every whispered order, every illegal action had been caught on video. And Leonard wasn't finished. 2 days later, a thick envelope appeared in the mailbox, stamped with bold red letters. "Notice of violation. Final warning." It accused my grandfather of a dozen new infractions, from illegal landscaping modifications to unauthorized vehicle storage, all of them fabricated. At the bottom was a signature in looping blue ink. Leonard Briggs, HOA President. "Desperate men make sloppy mistakes," my grandfather murmured as he read it. He slipped the letter into a folder marked evidence. Phase 2, and turned his attention to the next phase of Leonard's campaign. The following evening, another vehicle crept into the cul-de-sac. This time, the 2 men who stepped out wore tactical vests and utility belts stuffed with handcuffs and radios. They walked with more confidence, emboldened by Leonard's growing obsession. One of them held a clipboard with an official-looking seal. The other had a towing company patch stitched onto his sleeve. "This is the one," the taller man said. "Truck's got to go. Orders from the HOA." My grandfather, watching from the window, noted every word. He quietly picked up his phone and called the non-emergency police line. "Yes," he said calmly. "I'm reporting suspicious individuals trespassing on private property and impersonating law enforcement. I have video evidence." "Yes, I'll wait here." The men circled the truck, snapping photos and muttering about fines. One even slapped a fake tow notice on the windshield. But before they could take another step, 2 real police cruisers rolled into the street, their lights casting red and blue across the houses. "What's going on here?" an officer demanded as he stepped out, hand resting near his holster. The 2 men stiffened. "We're HOA security," one said quickly. "We're enforcing code violations." The officer's eyes narrowed. "HOA security doesn't issue warrants or tow vehicles from private driveways without a court order. Do you have one?" The man hesitated. "Well, no, but—" "Then you're trespassing," the officer interrupted, his tone now sharp. "And impersonating law enforcement is a serious crime." The confrontation ended with warnings and citations, but the real blow came later that night when the police report, written by those same impostors in a last-ditch attempt to justify their actions, contained false statements about my grandfather threatening them. It was a foolish move, one that elevated their harassment from civil dispute to federal offense. Leonard had overplayed his hand. While the impostors scrambled to explain themselves, my grandfather quietly went to work. Each evening, he sat at his desk surrounded by neatly labeled binders, compiling every piece of evidence: the videos, the letters, the photos, the fake warrants. He spoke to neighbors who had their own stories of Leonard's intimidation: a retired teacher fined for a flower bed, a widower harassed over a porch swing, a veteran accused of illegal gatherings for hosting a barbecue. Leonard's been bullying people for years, one neighbor, Mr. Halvorson, confessed, his voice trembling with anger. "We were too afraid to fight back." "Not anymore," my grandfather replied, sliding a witness statement form across the table. "This time we do it by the book." Word spread quietly but quickly. Neighbors who once stayed silent began showing up at his door with documents, letters, and stories, each one another brick in the wall closing around Leonard. What began as one man's fight was becoming a community's reckoning. But Leonard, blinded by arrogance, believed he was untouchable. He doubled down, holding late-night board meetings in his living room where he plotted new ways to pressure my grandfather. He even boasted about having friends in the county office who could make problems disappear. "He's bluffing," my grandfather said one night, reviewing the growing stack of evidence. And bluffers always fold when the truth is on the table. Still, there were moments when danger felt closer than ever. One evening, as my grandfather returned from a neighbor's house, he noticed fresh tire tracks across his lawn and footprints leading straight to the circuit box beside the garage. Someone had tried again to disable the cameras, this time leaving behind a torn scrap of glove caught in the latch. He bagged it carefully, labeling it for later. The storm was building, and Leonard didn't even know it. Each step he took to tighten his grip only tightened the noose around his own neck. Every fake citation, every trespass, every impersonation, all meticulously documented, all ready to be unleashed when the time was right. The same clipboard Leonard wielded like a weapon would soon be the very thing that condemned him. And still, my grandfather remained calm. He never raised his voice. He never lashed out. He simply watched, waited, and prepared because he understood something Leonard did not. Real battles aren't won with noise. They're won with patience, precision, and truth. By the end of that week, Leonard Briggs had no idea how close he was to ruin. His so-called HOA officers had crossed federal lines. False police reports were in circulation, and a growing number of neighbors, once too afraid to speak, were now united behind one man who refused to be intimidated. The board president thought he was untouchable, but in his quest to break a single man, Leonard had made a mistake far greater than any petty violation he had ever cited. He had turned a neighborhood nuisance into a federal investigation, and the storm he had unleashed was about to sweep everything he'd built into ruin. The plan had been taking shape for weeks, every step plotted with the same precision my grandfather once used to lead men through enemy territory. He worked in silence, never revealing the full scope of what he was building. To the casual observer, he was just an old man tending his yard and waving politely at neighbors. But behind closed doors, a counteroffensive was being prepared, one that would make Leonard Briggs wish he'd never picked this fight. It started with a few phone calls. Late at night, long after the neighborhood had gone still, my grandfather dialed numbers he hadn't called in years, brothers in arms from another lifetime. Some were retired Marines like him. Others now worked as investigators in federal agencies. Each conversation was calm, measured, and direct. He shared fragments of the evidence he had gathered. Photos of Leonard's hired impostors trespassing on private property, video of them cutting the power line, copies of falsified citations, and audio recordings of Leonard boasting about getting rid of the troublemakers. One of the men on the other end, now a federal investigator, was silent for a long moment before he spoke. "This isn't just HOA harassment," he said finally. "You've got impersonation of officers, wire fraud, possible embezzlement. This is criminal." "That's what I thought," my grandfather replied quietly. "I'm not asking for favors. Just watch closely. When the time comes, I'll need you here." Meanwhile, he turned his attention to the heart of Leonard's power, the neighborhood itself. Leonard's reign had thrived on fear and isolation, convincing homeowners that they were alone against his authority. My grandfather knew that had to change. One by one, he began reaching out to the men Leonard had targeted over the years, inviting them to quiet meetings in his garage. The first night, only 2 showed up. They were nervous, glancing over their shoulders as if Leonard might burst through the door at any moment. But when my grandfather laid out his evidence and explained how Leonard's actions had broken not just HOA rules, but actual federal law, their fear began to fade. "Leonard fined me $200 because my grass was half an inch too tall," one man admitted bitterly. "I paid it because I didn't know I could fight back." "You can," my grandfather said firmly, "and you will. But we do it the right way." By the second meeting, there were 8 men. By the third, there were nearly 20. They brought their own stories, photos of fraudulent fines, letters filled with threats, receipts showing thousands of dollars siphoned from HOA accounts. My grandfather carefully logged each piece of evidence, cataloging it with the precision of a field officer. He drafted affidavits and had them signed, turning their testimonies into sworn legal statements. For the first time in years, the neighborhood began to feel united, and Leonard had no idea that unity was building just beyond his reach. Still, Leonard strutted through the streets with his clipboard and self-importance. He handed out citations with a smug grin, lectured homeowners on order and standards, and bragged about how he was cleaning up the community. He spoke loudly about having the board behind him and how no one could challenge the president. He didn't realize the board was fracturing beneath his feet. A week before the next HOA meeting, one of Leonard's closest allies, a man named Grayson who had served as treasurer for 3 years, appeared in my grandfather's driveway at dusk. He looked exhausted, his eyes darting nervously. "I can't do this anymore," Grayson said. Leonard's been moving HOA funds into a personal account. He said it was for maintenance projects, but there's no paper trail. "If this goes down, I'm not going with him." My grandfather listened silently, then handed him a pen. "Write down everything you know," he said. "Every transaction, every conversation. This is your chance to do the right thing." Grayson did, and with that statement, the case against Leonard became ironclad. The night of the board meeting arrived with a sense of inevitability. The air was heavy and electric, like the calm before a storm. My grandfather took his time dressing in his Marine Corps dress blues, the same uniform he had worn decades ago when he led men through real battles. As he adjusted the medals pinned to his chest, he looked at his reflection in the mirror and felt a quiet resolve settle over him. This was not about revenge. It was about justice. The community center where the meetings were held was already packed when he arrived. Leonard stood at the front of the room, laughing with a few supporters and flipping through a stack of new violation notices. When he saw my grandfather step through the door, his smirk widened. Well, Leonard drawled loud enough for the room to hear. "If it isn't our resident troublemaker, here to complain about your wind chimes again." There was scattered laughter, but it was uneasy. People shifted in their seats, glancing between Leonard and the Marine who walked calmly down the aisle, his presence commanding quiet without a word. My grandfather stopped at the center table and set a thick black binder on it. He didn't speak immediately. He simply looked at Leonard, his expression steady and unblinking. "What's this?" Leonard scoffed. "More letters about how unfair the HOA is." "No," my grandfather said softly. "This is a record of every crime you've committed since you declared yourself king of this neighborhood." The room fell silent. Leonard blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me." My grandfather opened the binder and began sliding pages across the table. Photographs of men you hired impersonating officers. Video evidence of them trespassing and attempting to disable my security system. Copies of falsified citations and fake warrants. Witness statements from over 20 homeowners describing harassment and threats. And here, he tapped another section. Bank statements showing funds missing from HOA accounts, transferred directly into an account under your name. Leonard's face drained of color. "This is absurd," he snapped. "You can't prove." "You already did," my grandfather interrupted. "We have recordings of you bragging about getting rid of people you don't like. One of your own board members has provided a sworn affidavit about your embezzlement. And the false police report your men filed? That's a federal offense." A murmur rippled through the room. Several board members leaned forward, eyes wide. Neighbors whispered to one another, anger replacing the fear that had once kept them silent. Leonard tried to recover his composure. "Even if any of that were true, which it isn't, what do you think you're going to do? Sue me? Good luck. I have lawyers." "This isn't a lawsuit," my grandfather said, "and they're not here to arrest me." Leonard frowned. At that moment, the double doors at the back of the room swung open. 2 men in dark suits stepped inside, followed by uniformed officers. Their badges gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Conversations died instantly. The taller agent stepped forward. "Leonard Briggs?" Leonard's confidence evaporated. "WH, what is this?" "You're under investigation for multiple federal crimes, including wire fraud, impersonation of law enforcement, filing false reports, and embezzlement of HOA funds." The agent's voice was calm, almost cold. You have the right to remain silent." The color drained completely from Leonard's face. "This is a mistake," he stammered, backing away from the table. "You can't do this. This is my HOA. I'm the president." "You were," the agent corrected. As the officers moved forward, Leonard's bravado collapsed entirely. He tried to turn toward the board members. Tell them this is wrong." But no one spoke. The men and women who had once nodded along with his every demand now stared at him with a mix of anger and relief. Some even began to clap quietly as the cuffs clicked around his wrists. My grandfather didn't smile. He simply closed the binder, picked it up, and stepped aside as they led Leonard Briggs, the man who had terrorized the neighborhood, out the door. Outside, the night was cool and still, the streetlights casting long shadows across the quiet cul-de-sac. Neighbors spilled into the parking lot, talking in hushed, incredulous voices. Some shook my grandfather's hand. Others simply nodded, their expressions saying more than words ever could. "Thank you," Mr. Halvorson said, his voice thick with emotion. "We thought he'd never be stopped." "He stopped himself," my grandfather replied. "All I did was shine a light on it." As the last patrol car disappeared down the street, the neighborhood felt different, lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted. But my grandfather knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. There would be hearings, investigations, and fallout yet to come. And Leonard's grip on the neighborhood was broken, but the damage he had done would take time to undo. Still, as he walked home beneath the stars, binder tucked under his arm, my grandfather allowed himself a small, satisfied breath. Leonard Briggs had believed he was untouchable. He had built his kingdom on fear and arrogance. But he had forgotten one thing. A Marine never stops fighting. And tonight, the battle had turned. The air in the community center felt heavier than usual that evening, thick with the tension of a storm about to break. The monthly HOA board meeting had always been Leonard's stage, a place where he strutted and barked orders, where neighbors lowered their heads and accepted his word as law. But tonight, something was different. People whispered in the back rows instead of sitting silently. Men who once avoided these meetings altogether now stood shoulder to shoulder, their arms crossed, their faces hard with resolve. At the front of the room, Leonard leaned back in his chair, legs crossed arrogantly, a smirk glued to his face as if he owned the walls themselves. He tapped his pen against a stack of papers, glancing up at the clock. "Well," he said loudly, "let's get this circus started." I see even he decided to show up. His eyes darted toward the back of the room, when my grandfather had just walked in, wearing his full Marine dress blues. A hush fell over the crowd as he entered. The medals on his chest gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, and the polished shoes echoed softly on the linoleum floor with each deliberate step. He didn't carry anger in his posture, only calm purpose, the kind that comes from knowing you've already won before the first shot is fired. "Nice costume," Leonard sneered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Planning to salute the board, or just show off?" My grandfather didn't respond. He walked straight to the table at the front, laid a thick binder on the wood, and rested his weathered hands on top of it. The silence stretched, heavy and expectant. Leonard shifted in his chair, suddenly uneasy under the weight of the room's attention. "I've spent months collecting what's inside this binder," my grandfather said, his voice steady and unhurried. "Photos, video footage, financial records, even your own words recorded on tape." Leonard barked a laugh, though it sounded forced. "What on earth are you talking about? More conspiracy nonsense." "No," my grandfather said quietly. "Crimes." The room stirred. Leonard's smirk wavered as my grandfather flipped open the binder and began sliding documents across the table. Wire fraud, impersonation of officers, illegal fines, embezzlement from HOA funds. And that's just the beginning. For the first time, Leonard's eyes darted toward the door. Something in his chest tightened, an instinctive recognition that the walls were closing in. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "You can't just throw around accusations without proof." "There's plenty of proof," my grandfather replied. "Enough to build a federal case." As if on cue, the doors at the back of the room burst open. A dozen men in dark suits stepped inside, badges glinting against their belts. The air shifted instantly, fear rippling through the board members as the agents spread out across the room. Conversations died mid-sentence. Chairs scraped against the floor as people stood to get a better view. Leonard's smirk vanished. "Who are these people?" he demanded, though his voice betrayed a tremor. "Federal law enforcement." One of the agents answered, flashing his credentials. "We're here on official business." "You can't be serious," Leonard sputtered, standing abruptly. "This is harassment. He's making all of this up." He jabbed a trembling finger at my grandfather, who hadn't moved an inch. "Leonard Price," the lead agent said, stepping forward and reading from folder. "You are under arrest for wire fraud, impersonation of law enforcement, conspiracy, theft, and multiple counts of embezzlement." The room erupted in gasps. Leonard stumbled back, his chair toppling behind him. No, this is a mistake," he shouted. "I'm the law here." You were never the law," my grandfather interrupted, his voice cutting cleanly through the chaos. "You were a bully hiding behind fake badges and stolen authority." The so-called HOA officers, who had once stormed onto neighbors' lawns, now stood frozen as agents approached them. One by one, they were disarmed and handcuffed, their counterfeit badges sealed into evidence bags. The sight was surreal. The same men who had barked orders and threatened families now being marched out like criminals. Leonard tried to bolt toward the exit, but two agents intercepted him, gripping his arms firmly. "Let me go," he shouted, thrashing wildly. "I didn't do anything wrong." "Save it for the judge," one agent said flatly. It was then that the real blow landed, not from the agents, but from the very people Leonard had tormented. "Do you remember fining me for a broken mailbox?" One man called out from the back, stepping forward. "It wasn't even my mailbox, but you threatened to put a lien on my house. You tried to evict me for planting the wrong type of grass," another neighbor added, his voice trembling with anger. A third man spoke up, holding a piece of paper high. "This is my affidavit, and I'm not the only one who signed one." Dozens of neighbors began to rise, forming a line to hand sworn statements to the federal agents. Every single one told a story of intimidation, of fabricated violations, of stolen money. And every single one pointed back to Leonard. He stared at them, his face pale and his bravado gone. You can't do this to me," he stammered. "I built this neighborhood. I protected you." "No," my grandfather said quietly from the front of the room. "You exploited them, and now they're done being afraid of you." What Leonard didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the evidence my grandfather had presented wasn't even the full story. A sealed flash drive sat tucked inside the binder, containing a recorded conversation from just 2 weeks earlier. In it, Leonard bragged about getting rid of homeowners who didn't fit his vision, including a plan to forge inspection reports and have their properties condemned. It was the final nail in the coffin, and when prosecutors later played that recording in court, there was no defense left for him to cling to. The weeks that followed felt like watching a long, dark chapter close. Leonard's mugshot was plastered across the evening news. Prosecutors indicted him on a staggering list of charges, and his board members, desperate to save themselves, turned on him and signed full confessions. Even the bank records, once hidden behind shell companies, revealed a trail of stolen HOA funds leading straight to his personal accounts. The so-called empire Leonard had built crumbled in a matter of days. The HOA was dissolved under a federal court order, its fraudulent bylaws stripped away. In its place, the neighbors formed a new board, transparent, limited in power, and accountable to the very people it served. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like a community again. And my grandfather? He returned to his porch, the same spot where this battle had begun. The flag he'd once been flying for flew high and unchallenged above his home now, snapping proudly in the wind. He sat in his chair with a quiet dignity, sipping his coffee as if nothing extraordinary had happened, though everyone knew it had. Sometimes when I walked past and saw him there, I thought back to that day. The day 3 fake cops tried to arrest a Marine. The day they learned what real strength looked like. The day their empire of fear was dismantled by the very people they had once controlled. And every time that flag rippled in the breeze, I remembered, justice doesn't always come quickly, but when it does, it comes with a force that no bully can stand against. Because on that day, those 3 fake cops tried to arrest a Marine and ended up dismantling the very system they were trying to enforce. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of abuse of authority, harassment, and the powerful dignity of military service. This narrative aims to highlight the importance of respecting others and to inspire a deeper appreciation for those who serve and protect our country.